So just before jumping into this concept of building better roadmaps and really trying to tailor the outcome of those roadmaps, it's probably worth just giving a quick overview of us, as me, as Avolution, as a consultant working for Avolution. We're effectively an organization that produces an enterprise architecture tool. And what we really do, and I guess what I do particularly within the organization, is to try and solve various challenges that customers face. So we try to build the solution around various requirements that we get raised. And really, it's about tailoring some of the outcomes to those requirements at the beginning. So us as Avolution, as a company, have been going for a number of years now. So you might have heard of us, and this isn't going to be really a sales pitch necessarily, but it's really just to give you an understanding of where we're coming from, sharing our experiences across various customer sites globally. So hopefully today you'll get some understanding of some of the work we've actually put into play and some of the best practices around that as well. So Avolution is the company, Abacus is the product. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail around the product, but you might see a few screenshots throughout. But really what I want to focus on is the kind of value behind roadmaps, the value behind building them in maybe the correct way and maybe not the correct way, and the outcomes of that. And really just try to give you an understanding of how each of these areas kind of fit with each other. Now, typically, I guess the first question is, what is a roadmap? And I'm sure the majority of you, or if not all of you, have some understanding of what a roadmap is. There are many definitions, and I think it's always difficult to drill down into those definitions because road mapping really has a place in time and a context to it. So here in the UK, I would say not only does everyone on the call maybe know, but certainly the entirety of England has an idea of what a roadmap is these days, especially when on the news we're talking about road mapping our way out of a pandemic. So this is actually one of the first roadmaps that got presented over here in the UK during the early stages of COVID. This was a means of trying to communicate how we'd actually transition between different phases. Okay, so there's some terminology in there which becomes very relevant from a business context as well. But these roadmaps were essentially there to make us realize how we can actually shift and move through those phases. Part of the issue with some of the roadmaps, especially in this case, I guess, but also in business and the customers that we work with, there needs to be a commonality across those definitions. And one of the things most recently we've come across for the new roadmaps over here in the UK in the last probably 48 hours or so is there's a commonality across time. So time becomes a very relevant aspect of road mapping, whether it's product roadmaps, strategic roadmaps, all of these have some concept of time. The other key aspect here as well is this phased approach is important. You have this idea that we can go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, and exactly what we have here in the UK for this new government roadmap, that's the practical approach. It's very rare that you'll find that there's some kind of big bang approach to here's where we are, here's where we need to end. There's always going to be transition phases in between. So again, phases is a commonality, but time is also a commonality as well. So you'll even see here the various steps across this pandemic roadmap and how those are time boxed as well. There is an important aspect to those phases, something we will touch on a bit more later as well. But the idea is that each stage then influences the next. So it's always a relatively iterative process of going through these roadmaps in that as we complete step 1 and step 2, that can help redefine and reshape step 3 and 4. Okay, so they rarely sit in isolation in phases. They do tend to influence each other. And again, one of the important aspects of that is time. The time shifts as the outcomes and the feedback gets pushed across those phases, across those steps. So from a business context, or at least from an enterprise architecture concept, what does that really mean, and where do we actually start with this type of work? The first thing we've done is to define the course. So setting your course is really about understanding what you're trying to do, what kind of roadmaps you're trying to build, and the kind of vision, if you like, behind that. So part of this comes down to the goals and objectives you're trying to achieve, which lines of businesses are involved. Are we actually trying to, work on specific domains within the organization, whether it's around new regulations that come in play, our application landscapes, our product selections. All of these come down to how we define each of these roadmaps as well. Another key aspect are the properties or these attributes of these roadmaps. We're going to touch on these as we go through these slides, but really we do need some kind of way of measuring some kind of outcome, and measuring, I guess, the inputs that we're providing to these roadmaps as well. And finally, here's that communicating. We have to be able to communicate all these roadmaps relatively effectively. You would have seen those government roadmaps a few seconds ago. Certainly that first one wasn't, let's say, communicated as effectively as possible over here. And certainly the more recent ones, now that they have some time aspect, certainly have gone down better. So how do we break that down? So we've effectively got these kind of 5 road mapping success factors. Touching on these very briefly, because the idea is that this is your plan. And what we really want to touch on are the 4 styles that we've developed, and how we've actually deployed these across different customer sites as well. But these success factors really are some of the basics of starting for any piece of work. There has to be some kind of direction, some clear direction. The roadmaps, of course, are something that's executable. It's not just some utopia state that we really want to achieve, but deep down we know we're never going to get there. And of course, when we communicate these roadmaps, there needs to be a compelling case for that. Are we actually understanding where we are today? Have we identified all the issues, the risks involved with those roadmaps? And really, how do we actually convey that message to those people who are going to be executing this type of work as well? So when it comes to those 4 types of roadmaps, or the 4 styles, the first is this idea of tagging things, or what we might call heat mapping things. I mentioned time is a relatively generic or commonality shared across definitions of roadmaps. It's certainly what we'll come on to, but really we can break this down into simply tagging things. Now, what that really means is when we start tagging things with heat maps, we're effectively trying to understand the what aspect of roadmaps. What is going to be affected by any changes we make? So are we focused on our business capabilities? Are we focusing on our applications? Are we clear about what's actually changing within the organization? We can think about when and how later, but really the first thing is what's being changed and how later. The main, let's say, driving force behind trying to achieve the what is to provide some kind of clarity. So if we, example, have a one-page view of, let's say, our business capability landscape, diagrammatically, it's fine to have this type of work being done. But really, as soon as you start tagging and heat mapping this, we can start building an effective way of instantly identifying what red boxes do we need to focus on. Are we heat mapping this according to the things that are going to be affected? When we come to talk about the things that are being affected, it comes back to this kind of properties or attributes-based approach. We're going to talk about properties like life cycles, but really we can start thinking about, again, the reason and the vision for producing these types of views. If we're, for example, trying to understand our capabilities, what we are capable of doing internally, what processes are supporting those, we might have different metrics compared to whether we were looking at application landscape. So we have maybe the capabilities, maturity, its cost, and its complexity. Maybe from an application perspective, how well does it fit into the business? How many processes does it support? From a technical perspective, are we looking at things like the technology that supports the system, the applications, the tech debt that's been accrued over a number of different projects? How maintainable is the code behind those systems? Each aspect will allow us to heat map and tag things for different audiences and different perspectives. Now, an important aspect, as I mentioned earlier, was time, and life cycle becomes another type of property that we try to kind of use for building these roadmaps. I think over time, one of the things that we've found with customers is we can kind of segment life cycles into two different types or two different buckets. So typically when we start talking about life cycles, there are things that we can control internally and things we can't control, so maybe external things. So internally, for example, if we were building product roadmaps, of course we can determine when things get released, what new features come in, the timescales for those. These are internal life cycle dates that we can control. Externally, however, if we're reliant on different vendors or suppliers, different technologies, it's increasingly difficult to try and align, of course, to the support dates of those. So when we're trying to build roadmaps, we have to both consider the life cycle dates of things we can control, but also, of course, the things we can't. And those kind of life cycle dates spread across any type of roadmap. So I talked specifically about applications then, in terms of vendor life cycle dates, but there are things like regulatory requirements that come in play. Those are fixed dates typically. They might shift slightly, but they're fixed dates and things that we need to adhere to and become compliant with. So that again will have some kind of effect on our roadmap. So really, one of the best ways of actually visualizing this again. So this is, let's say, the problem that we're facing for trying to identify these types of life cycles. We can help by visualizing that in slightly different ways. So Gantt charts, for example, have always been quite useful for capturing that information. And roadmaps, let's say, at times just get boiled down to being a Gantt chart, which may not always be appropriate. But it's a typical thing that's within any organization. All we're trying to do is just shift that from being something that's relatively static, PDF reports and PowerPoints that people produce, into something that's a bit more dynamic. Can we actually drill down into the area that we're interested in? Can we see those live dates being updated, whether it's, again, internal, external influences? So that's why we try to build up these Gantt-style visualizations, but again, make them more dynamic. The third type of road mapping we've got in here is, I guess we've used the term work packages here, or interdependencies. And what we're really referring to is this sense of modeling things like projects and programs. And one of the reasons for that comes back to this phased approach. For building roadmaps, again, it's very rarely in isolation. So I talked in isolation around application landscapes, in isolation about product updates and features, new regulations that come into play, but this is all interconnected. When we develop applications, we're looking at the technology. What processes do we have involved internally? Do we have the right capabilities in place? Do we have the right hires or skills to actually build, maintain, and use these products and features? So when it comes to modeling roadmaps, work packages, interdependencies become a really important aspect to both understand the complexity, if you like, within those roadmaps, but also when roadmaps inevitably change, what's impacted. And seemingly what's I guess more so these days obvious is the direct impacts of change, less so these kind of indirect ones. So graph views like this, for example, these kind of network-based diagrams, and become really useful to try and understand that information. So again, giving context to those siloed pieces of information and understanding how it affects other areas of the organization. It's also important, I think, more so recently when you have a lot of kind of remote working and remote projects that are going on, it's always difficult to know where similar projects are affecting each other. Our project might be to rationalize our application landscape and retire some systems. Another project might still be requiring those in 6 months' time. So it's nicer to have this one-page view where we can actually understand how our work is affecting someone else's work. So there's a bit more of a traceability throughout the information, again, rather than acting as separate pieces of information. Now, the phased approach and the work packages or the programs and projects we manage then leads into this concept of what we call multiple architectures, probably more commonly this kind of performance of different scenarios. And what that means is if we're building a roadmap, we might be tailoring that roadmap for a specific purpose. However, again, we talk about isolating roadmaps, but there might be multiple roadmaps, multiple phases of a project. And what scenarios allow you to do is effectively understand, well, which is the best approach. So if we're migrating all our applications to cloud, if we have new regulations that come into play, if we're developing new product features, how do we actually provide and perform this kind of trade-off scenario? And so multiple architectures in our world helps us do that by understanding that we have these different states in time, and we can then run this metrics-based analysis across that information. Now, I've touched on properties and lifecycle dates and things like the business fit scores we might capture. Part of the issues we face with customers is sometimes there's an inherent lack of information, perhaps, or lack of data, let's say. So whether it's kind of spread across the organization, that might be the first challenge, but trying to understand how we can use that data is effectively some of the work and some of the solutions that I try to come up with as well. One of the tools we use for that, and you've heard things around low code and no code today as well, is this algorithm-based approach. So if we're designing two different scenarios, one might be focused on reducing complexity, one might be focused on reducing cost. And so there's a trade-off there. Perhaps there's a balance we're trying to reach. Perhaps there is a single kind of KPI we're focused on, which is, yes, we need to reduce costs, but in detriment of maybe the levels of conformance we have or the reliability of our systems. So understanding that balance between different scenarios becomes really important. Now, scenarios could be anything, of course. They could be pure time-based ways. We have customers working in a slightly more agile way where they'll freeze off quarters of a year and understand where they are, and their quarters become their roadmaps. So road mapping from an agile perspective is always interesting as well. But really, when you combine all of these stages, all of these steps, you end up with a slightly more coherent way of trying to communicate the information. We've tagged things in terms of what's being changed. We understand when they're changing because we captured those lifecycle dates. We understand how, now based on those projects, work packages, and scenarios that we've modeled, to realize the benefits and the trade-offs across each decision we're making. And again, this leads into some of the stuff we talked about before in terms of building migration plans for larger programs or projects. This is exactly where scenario planning comes into play. Now, of course, you can't always plan for every scenario, more especially these days, but it's important that there is a plan. And I think I've certainly seen pushback from customers where they say, well, we know the plan's going to change, so why have one? And I think we have to kind of push past that and understand that if you have something in place right now, it means you are aware it's going to be changing. There's a level of self-awareness there where we have something we're trying to achieve. We know what's needed to be done to achieve that. And if things change, we're in a better position to deal with those changes. So it's always important to have a plan, to have a roadmap of these types of, let's say, transformational projects that are going on internally. When it comes specifically to roadmap tailoring, one of the ways we try to address this really is, again, to maybe look at the use cases in play. So when we think about tailoring roadmaps, what we think of this as this dashboarding environment, really. I briefly mentioned earlier on this kind of static way of viewing content, PDF documents, PowerPoints, and they have their place. There's no denying that. Maybe less so during the working from home phases. But I guess what we advocate and what we see as the kind of driving force is roadmaps should be extensible across these use cases and across what we classify as these dashboards. So if we're road mapping for new technology coming into play, we might have a single place for that content, a single dashboard showing us what technologies we have, when are they coming to end of life, which different departments or regions use the technology. And all of this in one place means we can make those decisions quicker. Are there risks with certain technologies going to end of life? Who's going to be impacted by that? Is anyone keeping this maintained within this view? So it becomes really important to make sure that these are the types of views we can produce to then make decisions off that as well. Another important aspect of this is technical debt. I've done some WebExes or conversations around this before. So I won't go into too much detail here, but it becomes an increasingly difficult thing to manage, especially in the rate of change of new technologies coming into play. That's the first aspect. But the need to hold on to existing technologies and maintain that becomes even more difficult. And it's become a company-wide thing. And if anything, this is really the driving force behind building these types of dashboards. It's about communicating all of the work that you've done and making sure that the organization understands where you are. And so by having these dashboards available to everyone, everyone has some kind of context of what's going on, what's being changed, and how perhaps they're impacted by those changes as well. Even more so is this final view here around this business and IT alignment. And I guess I've always been relatively skeptic, is maybe the wrong word, between this classification of alignment between business and IT. I think in the past, the business has asked for something and IT has produced it. So I think the alignment issue there is the communication aspect. Things weren't communicated in the way intended. So again, having these views available, having all the information turned into these knowledge-based dashboards is a really important aspect, especially for those people who are making decisions on go, no-go processes for products or regulations that come into play. This kind of self-service environment that we're building just becomes really important. Again, more so now that everyone's working from home, everyone might have access to this information, so they have a clear, quite transparent way of working, rather than things are kind of kept away from people because no one wants to really say that their roadmap isn't aligned or on track. So this becomes another key thing from the perspective of the way we deal with customers, especially. Again, I appreciate that is, let's say, a lot of information to take in, but the takeaways there really would be, think of those 4 types of roadmaps and those kind of 5 success factors, and try to understand, again, that those roadmaps are there, they will be changed, and they will be consistently kind of changing over time. But really think of it as that kind of iterative approach. You're not building something to reach a state in 5 years' time. You're really trying to build them much more frequently, much more of a continuous cycle, let's say, throughout any project or program that you're working on. I think we're probably close to time, so let's just check the questions in here. Let's see. Okay, so we have a first question in here. So some best practices when it comes to building and maintaining portfolios to support roadmaps. Yeah, so this is a good question. I mean, roadmaps, let's say we've jumped straight into the idea that we have all this information. It's all at our fingertips. We can just build these roadmaps based on everything we know. That's the first hurdle, I think, to jump over. We need to find a way of getting that information. So the first thing, of course, is defining the vision, which I've explained at the beginning. But in terms of capturing this information, make sure that you know where the information is right now, whether it's in Excel spreadsheets, in AWS, in various systems that you're having internally. Make sure that you can build some kind of single repository of that. There's nothing worse than trying to build a roadmap and you're trying to scrape information from various places. You need a consistent baseline as the starting point, and then you need to build an iterative approach on top of that where you have phases to your roadmap. So where to start? I would say, look at where your information currently is, build a baseline, understand where you are currently, just so that you can know where you can be in the next 3, 6, 12 months' time. Another question here. So we have how to support decisions on top of agile product teams that have their own roadmaps. I know we're running out of time, but I'll answer this one relatively quickly. But I think there's always been a mismatch between agile and this kind of traditional way of roadmaps. Roadmaps are definitely a part of an agile practice. If you take a product roadmap where there's a whole bunch of different features that have been worked on, the idea is that you shift away from that view. If you focus too much on the number of features that are coming out, there's always going to be this huge product backlog. I think the important aspect here is what's the kind of high-level strategic plan for the development of that product. And you should treat each of those features as, let's say, stepping stones to reach that vision. So you don't really want to kind of diverge down different paths of kind of feature overload. Make sure that you understand what the vision is, what we're actually trying to do with this product, And that should hopefully then redefine the way we focus on things rather than getting bogged down into some of that detail as well. I realize I think I probably am over time slightly here, and I can see there are a couple more questions. And what I'll do is I'll reach out individually to you on those questions, and we can answer those and set up other sessions as well today, or of course anytime in the future. But because I am out of time, I will thank everyone again for attending. Feel free to reach out during this event. And again, if you have any other questions, of course, feel free to let me know. Again, thanks for your time, everyone.